So I'm joined today by Ed Monk, CEO of the Learning and Performance Institute. How you doing, Ed?
Good. Yeah, very good. How
Good
are you?
stuff. I'm doing all right, thank you. Yeah, not going to lie, sort of getting a little bit fed up of the sort of Groundhog Day, but can't complain. Staying positive and lots of good things going on.
Not
Very
look,
much.
not looking forward to lockdown 4 in a few weeks potentially.
Well, there's sort of rumours of that, isn't there? But let's get through 3 first. I found
Yeah.
that generally the fourth of any movie is worse than the third. So I'm hoping the trilogy is going to be sufficient. But very much looking forward to. We were just chatting before. After recording this, I'm going to be putting my tuxedo on at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday morning for the Learning Award. So I might just stay in the tuxedo. I think. And my new Wednesdays is going to be Tuxedo Wednesday, I think.
Why not? You say that as though it isn't already, Ollie. I'm sure that's just how you rock a
No,
Wednesday.
I'm more of a
isn't it?
Tuesday tuxedo man.
Are
Generally.
you? Right. Yeah. The alliteration. Yeah, that works better.
Good. Well, I appreciate you taking some time out, Ed. I know it's a busy time, but I thought there's a couple of interesting topics that we'd sort of like to dig into. There's been lots of talk given COVID and the impact, and particularly interested in the kind of the research and the data that I know you and the team have sort of got a lot of. So I'd love to sort of hear about that, and then maybe pick your brain and chew the fat a bit on maybe sort of the broader question of the future of L&D, which no doubt has changed significantly over the last 9 months. So yeah, we'd just love to sort of hear the LPI's perspective of sort of what you've seen as some of the impact to L&D, maybe from both the kind of providers side and the enterprise side, because you sort of have the luxury of sitting in both of those camps.
Yeah. I mean, thanks for inviting me on. It's great to chat with you, Ollie. I think if you look back now to last year, or maybe 11 months ago, certainly in the UK when the pandemic hit, the instant reaction was that obviously everything had to go online. So if you start with that basic foundation, there was a knee-jerk reaction to it. People were rapidly putting classroom content online with varying levels of success and varying levels of commitment to quality, let's put it that way. So huge vendors in the UK proudly declared that you can still do our courses and they're all online 3 days after shutting their offices, which you wouldn't have to be a genius or have 25 years of experience in L&D like I do. I think maybe you do as well, actually, to know that that can't really equate to a high quality level if you've managed to put all of your classroom content online. So some people did it right. And if you want a good example of an organization that I think did it really well, the NHS did it really well, actually. Dina O'Gorman, who works at Guy's and St. Thomas's, which is kind of like an NHS academy, they had a massive incident plan, as you would expect, ready from a learning perspective for if something like this were to happen. And in 48 hours, they were delivering online. But they already had the content online. Right. It was built for virtual classrooms. So they could pivot, which is obviously one of my most hated words of the last 12 months. that and mute, I guess, pivot and mute. But yeah, I think a lot of the vendors got it wrong, but just desperately trying to sustain revenues. Certainly classroom vendors struggled, major ones, major managed service providers that you and I will know really struggled in the first few months.
Yeah.
And then I guess the next stage of that, as we came out of it, was this realization that a kind of hybrid approach to learning was going to be more successful. People weren't just throwing money at e-learning. They didn't just want to throw content online, self-paced. They desperately wanted human interaction. The LPI has seen across the months that we've progressed through the pandemic, just exponential growth in that side, because people want the combination of a virtually human touch and the ability to do the learning in chunks whenever it's convenient for them. Yeah. But I don't think anybody expected that to happen, the sort of humanitization part, in as big a way as it did, Ollie. But certainly now, all the surveys that we do 2 a month at the moment. Everything is pointing to virtual classroom being currently the number one method for that reason.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's there's not many other situations where someone would have to use your favorite word, pivot that quickly. And it's sort of almost a bit of a mockery of, years and years of experience of instructional design, content design, structuring the experience of the classroom, and then expecting, like you say, within 3 days, let's scrap all that. It's all right. We'll just do it differently and it will be the same. And totally respect the sort of commercial drivers behind that. But to expect the sort of same outcome in the same period of time is sort of interesting one. And it sort of almost put everyone back into a sort of startup environment, the sort of minimal viable product, which I think is your point of, it started out doing that. People are like, well, it's okay. Like, I'm still doing something. I'm helping people. We're delivering some content. That's great. And now it's like, well, that's not working. What else is out there? So sort of, it's interesting to hear how that's now coming back to perhaps what, more forward-thinking organizations had already been doing, and sort of, well, look, we've been doing this for 12 to 18 months anyway. We didn't need that to happen. But is that sort of consistent with what you're seeing now, particularly, like you say, the virtual classroom area, which I know is a growing part of your business?
Yeah, for us, just on that side, and I'm not here to talk about, the LPI's success in programs, but as an example, 1,300% growth in virtual classroom certification programs. That's exponential, so I say that because that's an indication of what's definitely happening in internal L&D functions and in vendors. Actually, a lot of the people going on these programs are vendors who now want to be able to deliver their content in the virtual classroom environment, so they need the skills. But you touched on something there, which is, I think, underlying the trend towards virtual classroom. It's not just that's convenient. In fact, far from it. I used the phrase conspiracy of convenience the other day, which was first,
I love that.
it was first used by Nigel Harrison, performance consultancy expert. He used it in relation to the idea that, there's a problem that we need to solve at work. Let's build a program and send somebody on a course. Well, just send them on a course and that will fix the problem. I think the conspiracy of convenience now is more societal, in that we believe that speed of access to content is the number one driver. And the pandemic, ironically or paradoxically, has changed that. So you might be able to get great content really quickly, but how good will it be? How appropriate will it be? Is it contextualized? Is it culturally resonant for the company that we work in? Yes, convenient, I suppose, but is it constructive? Does it actually help somebody do the job better as well? So we've, in the last 12 months, L&D has matured more quickly than in probably the previous 5 years, I would suggest. And at the heart of that is two things: a real conviction around being agile that we didn't see before. So we had the programs in an L&D function. Those are the courses, and that's what we do. Not anymore. And I think it will have an interesting effect on the qualifications credit framework. Structures like that can't be agile because they depend on something existing for a number of years.
Yeah.
Take the LPI and its COLF program. It built 3 hybrid programs out of COLF to rapidly upskill people in 3 weeks, taking the COLF content and making shorter versions of that. And they were really successful because people did want to upskill quickly, but they wanted the core elements of COLF. And I mentioned there are probably two interesting, I guess, aspects to this. The first, agile, but the second is this commitment to people. And that might sound like a bit of a throwaway statement, but in August 2019, there was a group of American CEOs. I think it's called the Executive Committee or something, but it's a network of the top CEOs. So I think Bezos has stepped down just yesterday, but he was in there, for example, Bill Gates. They meet semi-regularly, and they came out of this meeting. I can't quote it, but the essence of what they were saying is that profit is not the single driver for their businesses anymore. They understand they have to put people first, and part of that is developing people. And then nobody thought that would be tested. So it's easy to say that, isn't it, prior to the pandemic? And then the ultimate test of if that's true comes along. Okay, so if you really care about people, then what are you going to do in this situation? And all of us, I'm a CEO, all of us were suddenly tested as to how committed are we to people. what happened next was really interesting. I think the way company owners and company CEOs responded to the needs of people. There was a huge rise in private healthcare commitments for companies. We did that straight away for everyone at the LPI. You saw rapid content development based on single tasks. So user-generated content rather than building courses. I know you need to do that. Claire in that department is brilliant at that. She can record a video for you and help you. And all of a sudden, you saw communities within organizations become really galvanized to help each other.
Yeah.
So I would hesitate to say the pandemic has been a good thing for L&D, because it's a terrible situation with hundreds of job losses and lots of furloughing. But it has made us, they say necessity is the mother of invention. It has made us think about things really differently. And I found it absolutely fascinating, actually, the way organizations, vendors and internal departments have responded.
Yeah, and whilst you were saying that, I was sort of thinking, how do you choose the words to say it's had a positive impact? It's maybe an accelerated impact. And, obviously we, in our business, sort of online learning, saw that boom sort of fairly early on. And again, fairly knee-jerk to specific needs, like, particularly small businesses never would thought about having everyone work at home. That was, we don't do that. That's just not a way of working. When suddenly you put all these people at home, like, how do you give them something? So like we changed the view and sort of gave a lot of content away to kind of offer some value. And that's been an exciting journey. But now it's definitely made those organizations think differently. And my point of sort of accelerating that change of like, well, if you weren't thinking that before, you should be thinking it now. And that's on quite a small level with small organizations, but likewise large organizations. I was chatting to one of the large banks, and they were sort of saying, well, this is probably just going to accelerate our strategy. It doesn't change it. This is what potentially, dare I say, L&D were not waiting for. That sounds awful, but kind of needing as the driver to kind of either convince further investment in whether it's the technology, the ways of working, or just alternative methods for delivery. So it's whilst it's been, as you say, tragic and very difficult for a lot of people, I do think it's isolated and accelerated some of the key drivers that need to happen to continue to support organizations in an effective way.
Yeah, I did another interview a few months ago at the beginning of the pandemic, and most commentators prior to the pandemic were talking about L&D being in a period of accelerated change. Yeah, I know. And then
what could they predict?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and now you kind of look 12 months later at what can be done when it's required to be done. I agree with you, actually. Not that anybody would have wished it, but the situation has sort of bizarrely reassured L&D and reassured companies who were looking at L&D that it is okay to do it this way. In fact, it would be even better to do it this way. We use the phrase at the LPI a lot, be where the learning is. Right. And whenever I'm asked at keynotes or in response to keynotes or panel sessions, which is the biggest learning provider in the world, the answer is Google, YouTube. That's where everybody's going to learn in reality. So how do you compete with that as an L&D function? And now I think the contextualization of content and creating a culture of user-generated content, that's where I can see things going. And in 25 years of being in L&D, you've seen e-learning make a huge inroads at the turn of the century, I guess, sort of mid-90s, then blended learning, micro learning. And if you look back on it, I would describe it as a period where, as I said earlier, our focus was on convenience or speed, from E to blend to micro to learning in the flow of work. And actually people want to maybe even take their time, heaven forbid, to learn something, not just be learning it as quickly as possible while I'm working. So I don't want to undermine the whole movement around learning in the flow of work. I think that's important. But I also think Google identified the number one aspect for successful teams, and it was psychological safety. I think it's Project Archimedes, something like that. Okay. Psychological safety was the number one reason, and that meant having the freedom to do things like learning, having the freedom to put your hand up and say you disagree with the approach that we're taking, whatever your role in the business. And I think that democratization of decision making, and giving people the freedom and the permission, I think, to learn, to do their jobs better, has changed in the last 12 months, without question. And if I may add one thing, actually, when we asked over 2,000 now chief learning officers what their #1 challenge was, I predicted that I thought it would be the digital transformation of L&D, which is everything that's happened in the last few years. It's still the big problem, isn't it? But if this doesn't indicate in one statement what we've just said, then we may as well forget it. Or I may as well forget it. The #1 thing that is a challenge for CLOs is building a learning culture. And the second biggest challenge is digital transformation. And that tells you that L&D leaders are bothered about their people and the culture, not about speed of access to content.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we sort of touched on that last time we spoke. And I find that interesting because a lot of our conversations with prospects are trying to help solve that. And I always sort of find myself thinking, I don't know if I'm going to be able to help you. Like, I don't have that solution, that piece of technology, that piece of content that's going to drive the culture of learning. As we know, I'm no expert on that, but there's a number of other factors that influence the culture. Like you say, psychological safety. Are people aware of why they need to learn? Do they have space? Are they motivated? Like, I've always thought, content is information versus learning is the application of that content. So what else are you doing? You can sort of see prospects of thinking, but you're not helping yourself here by saying, so if I buy this thing, are you going to help drive this culture? So yeah, it definitely resonated when you said that when we spoke before of like the #1 challenge. And I mean, maybe have you got sort of thoughts of where you're seeing that being done well across some organizations, of kind of some of the ways people are solving it, or are there still too many people trying to solve it that there's not some great examples?
No, I think you touched on the problem, really. The reason why it's not an exact science, although there are people who I would recommend reading who would consider it an exact science, actually. So culture in an organization, I would argue, is very difficult to build. It can be engendered or fostered and nurtured, but to build a culture is quite difficult. Frances Fry has written a book with her partner. It's called Unleashed. Maybe we could link to it
Okay.
in the notes with this. That, I think, is the best book on culture. And she quotes Edgar Schein, who's like an MIT professor, to get people to, I'll get this right, to get people to behave reliably the way you want, even in your absence, you need to get them to think the way you want. And the first time I read that, I thought it was quite controlling. Like, how do you get them to think the way you want? But it's brilliant how she opens it up. She's the woman that, I don't know whether you know, there was a whistleblower in Uber who
Yes.
a few years ago, and stories of terrible things, sexual harassment, bullying, and it resulted, I think, in the CEO and losing his job. She was brought in as the kind of culture doctor, Frances Fry. This book's written by her and her partner, and it took no time for her to sort it out. And she started, which I think is the value here, by asking lots of questions, and just listening. Where do you go to learn things then? Where would you go if you were complaining? And she didn't just listen to the answers. She observed how people interacted when they were answering the questions and what happened next. So she talks even about people weaponizing culture. So that's how things can become toxic. We've just talked about psychological safety and having the freedom to learn. Let's say that you and I in our companies decided that we would make Fridays learning day. And you don't have to do the normal work. It's now a learning day every week. That can be abused. I mean, it would be great if it worked, wouldn't it? But it can be abused, and then it can become weaponized. And people aren't learning at all, but they'll say they're learning. And then you've got secrecy and subterfuge building and skepticism and cynicism. So it's really difficult. It's really difficult to build it. I'll give you an example, which is an oft quoted one by me. I probably need to find a new one, but it's my favorite one. Having done a talk for Teach on Mars, actually, the platform, Teach on Mars, a couple of years ago, which was in the south of France. Always happy to do those if anybody's watching, listening to
What was
this.
it that incentivized you to go to that one?
I know, yeah. That's one of those where I was more than happy to say yes, put it that way. But there was a lady on the panel there, and forgive me, I don't know her name. Maybe I'll find it, and again, we could put it in the notes, from AXA. And she was talking about how they built a learning culture. And it really surprised me. And having been in this industry as long as I have, it does take a lot to, surprise you and think that is actually completely different. I would never have thought this would work, definitely not in a financial institution, but they created the Learning Olympics. Wow. And learning became competitive. I was thinking, this has got disaster written all over it. That's because, it's just not going to work. And it did, it really worked. I guess with one exception. She was saying that there's one person, I think it was in Egypt, who worked for AXA, who was just learning, didn't do their job and was the #1 learner and winning gold medals, but forgot that you were supposed to actually use that learning to do the job better. But, across the board, everybody was really committed to it. They were attracting great talent into the business, retaining the best talent, and everything just went up a level.
Yeah,
which is fantastic. But I do remember being there with people from high-end luxury retail companies, and there was a lady next to me. I definitely shouldn't say the company name, but she was the CLO of one of the kind of ultimate luxury retail brands, fashion brands. She said, if they tried to do that in my organization, there would be fatalities. which is kind of where I was coming from, the idea that competitive learning.
Yeah,
I'm not so sure. So the point I'm making is it works. It will be different for every single organization. To build a learning culture in the NHS, probably going to be different to building a learning culture in Chanel. It wasn't Chanel, the lady. I'm using that as an example. So there are different types of organizations with different challenges. And I think you start by listening, extracting the data. Laurie Nels-Hoffman, who we both know, excellent on that topic. Always worth kind of looking at things that she's written on extracting the data first. And then you have the answers, you have the facts to be able to then go ahead and try and build a culture. Utilizing technology, which you were at the Learning Awards a couple of years ago when I put my neck on the line. People had said, what's the magic equation for learning and development? And instead of trying to be complicated, I think it is now people plus technology equals performance. You do have to have both things to drive organizational and individual performance. Technology isn't the ultimate panacea without people involved in it, but oh my goodness, does it make a difference compared to just instructor-led classrooms? So the three things are synergistic, I would suggest.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, it's interesting the sort of technology plus people. That maybe links on to the sort of the next point around. Unfortunately, we didn't have learning tech this year, but that's always a sort of good example of a crowded market. As often as I say, sort of technology sometimes looking for a problem, and sort of we see lots of examples of people that have implemented things that aren't working. And we had a discussion last week around. How do you really make sure that you're applying the right technology to the right problem, and whether that be through sort of consulting or just understanding what are you trying to achieve and how you're trying to achieve it. So I'm interested from the sort of your experience in the vendor side, without sort of breaking too much confidence, maybe some of the challenges that vendors are seeing from customers that have maybe bought this sort of holy grail of a piece of technology, and how they're maybe trying to sort of develop that or utilize that more effectively to deliver some outcomes.
Yeah, on the vendor side of things, the #1 challenge for vendors, certainly technology providers, is that their clients on renewal of licenses are saying that the utilization stats are way too low. Learning officers of large companies who bought and say, look, we spent thousands on this and it's not really being used. I think the problem is that the LXP providers, maybe I'm being a bit controversial here, but are not necessarily as concerned about the employee engagement piece as they are about the technology being purchased. Now I don't want to tar everybody with the same brush, but obviously, you talk about learning technology is a huge showcase event. And if you looked again and analyzed the data as to what type of companies are there, you'll see it's moved to, you know, hundreds of LXPs being there over the last few years. And, you know, one will say, well, we've got this thing that does this better. Ours is 0.6 seconds faster to engage. And it's that conspiracy of convenience that we were talking about earlier, which I think drives that behavior. So two factors are affecting the success of the learning technology market at the moment. I think it's a lack of commitment to the implementation piece.
Okay.
So if culture is the number one challenge and the number two challenge is digital transformation, the LXPs only want to solve the second one, is the feeling amongst CLOs. That's what they tell us. What any advice for anybody from an LXP listening or watching this, where you said, here is our platform and here is how we make it work over a 6-month period. This is our free content on building a culture, engagement strategies, user-generated content, examples of what works well. And this is the person who's going to look after you for 6 months to make sure it's happening. That's what they really want to see. And actually, years ago, invited me in to do a talk, 6 LMSs over a decade.
So
they were about to get another
26 one. 26 LMSs.
26 LMSs over a decade they'd purchased, and they were about to buy the 27th because that one was going to solve the problem.
Wow.
Which you kind of, you know, I mean, what analysis have you done, and what is it that you're trying to achieve with it? So there's an issue on the CLO side where sometimes the maturity isn't there as a purchaser to understand that this isn't necessarily going to do everything as I've been sold. So there's a genning up that needs to happen amongst the CLOs. But equally, on the vendor side, more of a commitment to the people, the efficacy of the product would be good to see, I think. Yeah. And I think you'll see that because of the pandemic and the people side of things becoming more important. I think you'll see LXPs trying to address the issue of learning culture as they sell their products.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally valid, and we sort of see some of that around, you know, people wanting to make solutions work. As you say, you know, there are various differences with different platforms, or even sort of in our own market, but it's people feel much more committed to making that work for them, rather than the example you've shared there with, you know, 27th time, this time is really going to work, right? Never mind the sort of ones that went before. So it's now, how do we leverage what we've got? Like the cost of change, the time to change, the complexity, like all of that becomes almost in the too hard pile. So we're seeing a lot of conversations where people are saying, we've made this investment, you know, we've got to make it work. Like which I think is exactly your point. It's not the technology, it's the sort of how you use it side that's really going to start to make a difference for people.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see renewal stats on LXP license and then don't renew at the end of the 3 years. I think we're moving from an idea that technology alone is the answer. Even the technology companies are realizing that, and there's a people aspect to this. Starts from the top with the CEOs, as we talked about the exec committee in the States, and even the main IT vendors are looking to give away software during the pandemic. Zoom and Microsoft, I think Teams licenses were given free during the period, so that's great. And there's more of a humanitization, I think, of digital learning, if that's even possible, which that's got to be a good thing, right? I mean, you know, we all want to be, if we can, be working and earning money and contributing to society. So whilst there's a lot of talk around, you know, automation of a number of jobs, the World Economic Forum points to a cumulative increase in jobs as a result of automation. So there are going to be more jobs, but there'll be different jobs. I think they said 27% of jobs in 3 years' time that will be taken in 3 years' time don't exist now.
Wow.
I mean, that's massive in terms of change, which must mean, if you look at who's going to be responsible for that, then, you know, 27% of jobs that will be existing in 3 years' time don't exist now. Whose role is it to upskill and reskill those people in 27% of all jobs that exist. It'll be L&D. So there's never been a better time to be in L&D. It's been described as an economic imperative by The Economist. It's that we need to be doing the right things, not just thinking that technology alone is the answer. I know it go one, by the way, and I'm not just saying this, that you have been committed to that. I consider it a people-focused organization from everything that we've talked about. And it's the same with the LPI, you know, but it's just interesting to me that the pandemic has accelerated a digital transformation change period that people were talking about being fast already, and it wasn't. And now out of the back of it, of a huge period of DT, you're seeing people being the number one part of it. That's encouraging to me, actually.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary, and just to sort of reiterate that, I saw the results of Donald Taylor's sentiment survey, and sort of almost appeared from nowhere the sort of the upskilling, right-skilling agenda, right? That's normally it's sort of the top 4 or 5 move about a bit. Is it curation? Is it personalization? Suddenly, from nowhere comes this sort of right-skilling, upskilling, agenda, and your point there, I think eloquently explains it. I think that's a fascinating stat of. As you say, 27% of roles don't exist. Like 3 years is not a long time to upskill a whole bunch of people in a new set of skills.
Exactly. But the first move on this, I think I would say, one big move is Microsoft. They launched we're a partner for Microsoft on this program called Get On 2021. And that is they're throwing millions at upskilling and reskilling people in digital jobs. So I think it's just been a chance over the last 12 months to reflect on what the future is going to look like. We've never had the amount of time that we've had, at home to be thinking about these things. And instead of just constantly going in that direction, going, let's more convenient, let's get more convenient L&D. Now it's like, hang on, we're not prepared for what's going to happen. We're just sort of, throwing buckets of water out of a boat that's going under. It's just, there was no plan really. We're completely reactive. No. And now L&D is front and center of how businesses are going to operate, with people being at the forefront of that. Profit, it will always be the North Star. It's always what companies have to aim for, obviously, but they're like meandering on that journey by making sure they're committed to people on the way and the individual learner and how they learn, actually. And that's fantastic. I'm actually, pandemic aside, if we can come out of this situation, big if, and go back to some level of normality, I'm actually excited about how important L&D is going to be perceived to be and be by CEOs in the next 3 to 5 years. It has to be, with that stat, 27% of jobs, it has to be.
I agree. I think that's been great, Ed. I think that's a very poignant point to wrap up. Really appreciate your time and conversation as always. But thanks very much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Ollie. Cheers.